Now that I've gone over most of the other elements, it's time to talk about the two, I would say, largest elements of this game. The game manager and the player manager. First, let's quickly take a look at the attractor input though. I was briefly mentioned when I talked about the attractor level. Like I said, it's just checking to see if 1 or 2 is pressed, and then setting the appropriate values within the player manager, and then swapping the scene. The game manager is simply a hub for the global elements of the game. Surprisingly, there are not that many, as you can see. So, the game manager is in charge of the font, for one. When it starts up, it just initializes the font, and then it returns it whenever it's needed. Every time a centipede dies, the game manager will check and ask the critter list if the centipede is dead. If it's dead and the player is or the player is dead, if it's alive or the player is dead, it returns. And if it's otherwise, it will end the wave and it will start up the next wave. So, let's go into the player manager. The player manager is in charge of a lot of things. Everything related to players is stored here. And because mushroom fields are also related to players, that gets stored here as well. Because high scores are related to players, that gets stored here as well. So, let's go over the functions first. Receive alarm, as I've mentioned, is just receiving the alarm. We have wave end, game start, and scene end, which all are called whenever the name implies. Add points is for the score manager, and it adds points to the current player. We have get current player. These are all functions that return something, so they're usually for getting information from the player manager. Get current player is the player dead, getting the current field, the high score, current points, getting the other player's points, yada yada. Top scores and top names are for the high score. Set multi determines if there are 2-player or 1-player mode. Player death is called when the player dies. Respawn player is for respawning. Regen done, check score. Regen done notifies the player manager that the regeneration process is finished and it can move on. And then check score is a private, semi-private function for near the end when we need to check if the player has a new high score and we need to prompt them to input their name. And then add name is for adding in the name to the list of high scores. Looking at the information itself, current index is simply the controller over which player is the current one. So you'll notice if we go over here to player list, lives, points, and waves, it's all 3, and the field list as well. It's all 3 because we have 3 players, the AI, player 1, and player 2. And current index determines which of those 3 players is the currently active one. 2-player determines if we are in 2-player mode or not, and pdead is simply if the player is dead. We store the high score of all time, and then we store the 8 highest scores and names as well. Moving into the actual functions, we have our initialization, which simply creates the fields, initializes the lives, points, and waves of everything, and then deactivates the 2 non-fields that we are not using, and then sets up the current player. This, within the context of the player manager 2, will always refer to the AI itself. So, when we initialize, we will always end with the AI being the current player. And that's because this function is only called when the attractor mode is being set up. Game start is called when we are moving into 1 or 2-player mode. And current index is set to 0. As you can see, we create our player, And as I mentioned way back in our first video talking about the player, this is where the player manager controls the setting up of the linking the input to the player itself. If we hop back to the header, we see the keyboard manager and AI manager. The player manager only has one of each, and it will give the player either or. It will either give the player an AI manager or a keyboard manager, and it's only ever one, because it's one. Receiving alarm. Alarm is only used for player respawn. Wave end. We simply notify the wave class that it needs to set up the next wave. Adding points. We add on the current amount of points to the current player, and then if they have reached a new threshold for 12,000 points, we give them another life. Getting the other points is a bit of an if statement, but it simply returns 0 if we're in AI mode, otherwise it returns the other player's points. Respawn, we check to see if we have enough lives, and if we don't, then we simply stop the wave. And we call final death, which is right here, and we'll get to in a bit. Otherwise, it simply tells the mushroom manager to on respawn player, it simply tells the wave to reset up the old wave into the centipede factory to respawn the current centipede. In final death, we deactivate all the fields for player 1 and 2, and then if we check to see if we have a new high score. If we do, we create a player input that prompts the player to put in their name. Otherwise, we will swap back to the tractor mode without ever prompting them. However, before that, we will respawn the field, because as I said in my mushroom field video, it's to prevent the one player from having the field of an old player. Add name. We'll see when we talk about our UI later. However, it just receives a new high score and places it appropriately within the order of names. Check score is a semi-private function. It's only used by the UI, and it's basically checking to see if we have a new high score with the second player. Long story short, the player manager checks first player to see if they have a high score. If they do, it creates a player input. Once that player input receives enter, it will call on this check score function to see if we have 2 players and if the second player has a high score as well. Respawning fields is basically just telling the fields to respawn themselves, as I mentioned. Player death handles all of the fun player death mechanics, such as clearing the critter list and stopping the wave, which prevents any new respawns, and it clears all critters from the field. And then we regenerate all mushrooms on the field. Once the regen is done, we swap players. If we have 2 players, we move over to them. Otherwise, we just simply call on the game alarm to respawn us, which basically, after a small delay, will create a new player. So that's the entirety of the player manager.